Everyone to the captive audience. I'm Kevin Hoare, and it is Memorial Day, the 2023, the 29th of May, and we're doing a special show here today. And with me is Vance Day, former Oregon Republican Party chairman, former circuit court judge, and also somebody who is very familiar with the story that we're going to highlight today of one Sergeant Don Malarkey, who, as many of you may have seen over the years, was a prominent member of the Band of Brothers, Easy Company, portrayed in the HBO miniseries several years back, but yet it resonates. And Don was a resident, longtime resident of Oregon, and so we thought that would be a great thing to do today, and highlighting Don's life, but also the perspective that Vance can bring, having spent many years with him in a very special role, bringing this story. In fact, this, Vance, is the first time that you and I met. Was in 2003. I wandered into a room at the Western States Republican Leadership Conference in Portland, which it's even amazing that we might hold such an event in Portland, looking back. But I wandered into a room, and there was videos being portrayed on the screen, and it was scenes from the Band of Brothers, and you standing there, pausing it and talking with Don about that scene that he was portrayed in. So that's how we first met many years ago. So welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us here on Memorial Day.
Well, Kevin, it's good to be with you and those who follow your program. I appreciate being on, particularly on Memorial Day. Memorial Day started after the Civil War, when the families of the dead veterans or the soldiers killed in both the blue and gray would come and decorate their grave sites, and they called it Decoration Day. And they would each year do that, and eventually over the years it became Remembrance Day and included other conflicts, and then eventually Congress set it aside as a federal holiday, calling it Memorial Day. And the interesting thing about the word Remembrance Day, at least in the Hebrew, the term in ancient Hebrew means to call up before you again, or to relive it, to bring it as if it is in the present, to bring the past into the present. It's not just the sense of memory, remembering these people. It's actually bringing them forth, celebrating, talking about them, moving through what happened to them in a auditory and if you can, with pictures or whatever it is. That's the concept. And so it's important that on Memorial Day that we remember the Gold Star families, those who have lost loved ones in conflict or through conflict, and there are many people who I think we brush up against in our daily lives that have endured the loss of a family member. We celebrate veterans on Veterans Day, but today we celebrate those who died in combat or through combat, either their wounds or disease or in the service at the time. I think it was, I got a quote here from H.W. Longfellow, the poet, says, "Your silent tents of green we deck with fragrant flowers. Yours has the suffering been, the memory shall be ours." And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my good friend Don Malarkey, and mainly, his buddies who perished in World War II, because those are the ones that we're really remembering today. But it was Don and Buck Compton, Dick Winters, and the rest of Easy Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne, who talked about and were able to bring into the present the memories of those men who died in World War II, as they fought the fascist Axis. And so I think it's appropriate we do that today. So I appreciate that, Kevin.
Well, and I think that this particular story of the Band of Brothers, not just because of how it was portrayed, Easy Company, but it was at that moment in time where there was a generation that you might think could become somewhat disconnected from the events of such a long time ago, while many of these members of the Band of Brothers were still alive
Mhm.
when the miniseries was made. So I always found it really interesting the way the series would have the dramatic portrayal by actors that, by the way, now we all know these actors. They're famous actors that have been in other TV shows and movies. Some of them were really just getting started with their careers, in fact, when this miniseries was made. So you recognize them. But then at the end, at the beginning and end of each of the miniseries episodes, they talked with the real guys that were alive. And
Mhm.
Don was one of the people that was portrayed in there. And this was not just any military unit, right? I mean,
No, it
paratroopers
wasn't. Not at all.
paratroopers are an entirely different thing. They were essentially the special forces of World War II, the way they were
Mhm.
trained, weren't they?
Well, and they, you know, how many people in 1940, 41, 42 had, 1, been up in a plane, and number 2, jumped out of a plane in a parachute?
Yeah.
I mean, Don used to say, "Why would I go up in a plane and jump out of a perfectly good plane to, in a parachute? Why would I do that? Except because I believed in what we were doing and I wanted to be part of the best of the best. I didn't want to be in some schlocky unit where I couldn't trust these men who were next to me to have courage or honor or have the physical prowess to be able to do what combat requires you to do." And when he was offered the opportunity, 50 extra bucks a month when he was in basic training, he said, "I want to go into those, what do they call them? Parachutists." And that's what they originally called them, parachutists, and then
Parachutists.
eventually paratroopers. And he was brought into the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was trained in Toccoa, Georgia. In fact, I was just texting with Don's youngest daughter, Mary Ann Malarkey McNally, and she's a speaker this Friday. Um, in honor of the Toccoa group that was trained there on behalf of her father. It's a big gathering, and it's in Toccoa, Georgia. They've rebuilt the camp, and you can stay there. And it's interesting how history, when it's honored, tends to inspire those in the present. And I believe strongly, Kevin, that when we honor those who have come before us, we inspire those who come after us. And for me, the story behind the story with the Band of Brothers, $200 million plus at 10-hour miniseries, at the time the most expensive miniseries in television history, really starts back in, of course, the late 1980s, and that's when the group of men were talking amongst each other. They'd been to a reunion. Don went to his first reunion in 1984. Before that, it was really hard for him because he was one of the few soldiers who were not awarded the 4% of the original company that were not awarded the Purple Heart. Think about that. 96% of those 160 original guys were either wounded or killed in combat. And those are horrific statistics. It was 20, I think it's 24% were killed in combat. It was 72%, I believe, that were, wounded in combat. And then there were 4% that of the original guys that were not. Don was actually wounded, but he refused the Purple Heart because it was a hand wound. He had been out. It was in Karatan. They were the Germans were mortar shelling them. And Don, he said, like a blanking idiot, I put my hands over my helmet instead of under my chin. And I got a piece of shrapnel that hit me in the hand. And he said, when he went in to get Doc Rowe to fix him up, he looked at the other guys who were, just torn to shreds. And Doc Rowe said, "Hey, that's a Purple Heart." And Don said, "Nope, it ain't." And he walked out and he bandaged it himself and he wouldn't report it. That's the kind of guy Don was. He served more days in combat, documented, than any other Easy Company member.
Hmm.
And he suffered greatly, greatly. He had a very good memory, and there's a good side to that, and there's a difficult side to that, because he would at times dream. I mean, we traveled together for 10 years, and many times they would just think, they'd make a mistake and they end up getting one king bed in a hotel room, and I'd tell Don, "You touch me during the night, I'm going to punch you." And but after our teaching on leadership and using Band of Brothers as the fodder for helping people understand the principles of leadership and emotional intelligence, Don would dream. He would be back in combat, and he'd shout in the night and roll around and fight. And I mean, I got a really, he was one of my best friends, and I got a really interesting view into the painful psyche of a person racked with, with memories of combat, and that PTSD that he suffered from. But near the end of his life, after about 10 years of traveling with him and speaking at hundreds of different events, including teaching leadership at the White House and members of Congress at West Point, and we traveled to Europe, let's see, 3 separate times, did tours through the battlefield. He, Buck Compton, myself, Don. I watched him heal. The more he talked about it, the more at the beginning, he could not. I mean, one of our first presentations was for the OSP leadership team, about 50 sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and he must have cried. It was an 8-hour teaching session, and he must have cried once an hour on stage. And I just put my arm around him, and he'd blubber and say, "Oh, I'm Irish, I'm all emotional." But man, it pulled the crowd into him. They just loved him because he was so real and raw with his emotions. He was transparent, and he would talk about Skip Muck and his best friend, and how he got killed in a foxhole on January 9th, 1945, in a little town called Foy, in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. They were surrounded by the Germans, outnumbered 25-1. It was. I just watched him over the years. By the end of the 10 years that we were traveling together, he wasn't able to physically do it anymore. But he didn't dream in the night anymore. He wasn't racked by those memories. And I think it was just being able to tell his story again and again and again that kind of in his cerebellum and cerebral architecture began to take those sequestered pockets of pain and integrate them throughout his memory, so that he wasn't triggered anymore when something would happen, or he'd watch a video. And that's the beauty of how we are created. Our brains heal, and I
You know,
got to watch that process.
that's really interesting. I know of a specific example that I was involved with somebody who served a couple tours in Iraq, and um, good friend of mine as well. And I just worked with him to tell his story, with some presentations that were done to like local groups, Rotary clubs, Elks Lodges, that kind of thing. I found out years later that he told me that helped him heal,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way, exactly the way you described it.
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's an interesting way that the architecture of our brain. My wife, who's a amazing trauma therapist, has taught me a lot over the years. And of course, when I was serving as a circuit court judge, I had the opportunity, along with my wife, to get a federal grant for our team, to start a veterans court, and we did that. And we worked with psychologists and we had 12 people on our team to work these veterans through the system, and we saw the same thing, that as they were talking about it and were able to do so in a non-threatening environment to share their stories, the brain heals itself. It the re-architectures it those difficult places where memory is stored, then when they get dispersed through talking about it and working through those terrible traumatic incidences, tends to heal. One of the things that I think started that journey for Dawn um, was in 2001. It was Memorial Day. It was 22 years ago.
Mm.
And I was, I think at the time, treasurer of the Oregon Republican Party, or fifth congressional vice chairman. I can't remember, one of those positions that, that volunteer position that takes a lot of time and gets you a lot of flack.
Yeah.
And but I had worked closely with a lot of the Republican legislators. Mark Simmons was the Speaker at the House at the time. Gene Derfler was a friend and World War II vet. I didn't know Governor Kitzhaber very well, but I later on he appointed me to the Marion County Circuit Court in 2011, and we worked closely together on a lot of veterans issues. But that was in 2001, 10 years before I went on the bench, and the idea was, what are we going to do for Memorial Day? Let's find an Oregonian who exemplifies the character, the honor, the sacrifice, and then give them an award of some sort. So we began to talk about it, and we came up with what was called a citation exemplar. And I think I sent you a picture of it earlier today. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read it to your audience, because it really captures what we need to be remembering on this Memorial Day. It says, and this was read by Mark Simmons, and the presentation was done in the House of Representatives. It says as follows: nearly 60 years ago, the United States of America was plunged into armed conflict against the Axis powers. The fury of an aroused republic was ignited, and our nation responded with an army of citizen soldiers. Oregonians went to war. The character of our citizens was greatly tested during the Second World War. As a people, we were emerging from the severity of the Great Depression, when a generation was called upon to sacrifice the flower of its youth. As a people, we fought the challenge to life and liberty through acts of self-sacrifice, both here and abroad. As a people, Oregonians gave of themselves in countless battles and in innumerable acts of mercy. In recognition of the great moral debt owed to a generation of those who sacrificed so much that we as a people might extend and fortify the borders of liberty in honor of those Oregonians who participated in service of our nation during the Second World War, we issue this citation exemplar to Sergeant Donald G. Malarkey. Having exhibited the character traits of honor, courage, discipline, and self-sacrifice, Donald G. Malarkey stands before us as an exemplar of those countless Oregonians who gave so much that the world might glimpse, if even for a moment, the liberty of a republic. We issue this citation exemplar to honor those who have gone before us, so that we, as a people, might follow their example. Memorial Day 2001, signed by Senator Gene Derfler, President of the Senate, John A. Kitzhaber, M.D., Governor of Oregon, and Representative Mark Simmons, Speaker of the House.
Wow.
It was a beautiful ceremony, and Don and his wife were up in the gallery with a fellow Oregonian who was part of the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, originally Easy Company, and then he was with D Company. And Don was just, moved to tears, and that started a long series of. It was before Band of Brothers was finalized, and not many people knew of Don. Stephen Ambrose had written the book Band of Brothers in 1991, and he decided to do that book. And I talked to Ambrose about it because I was with him on D-Day, the 60th anniversary, D-Day 57th anniversary of D-Day 2001, when Band of Brothers was premiered in Europe, meaning it was the first 2 hours that they showed, and they had all the veterans there, Tom Hanks and everybody was there, and my family and I were invited as special guests because we were producing a smaller documentary on the Battle of Breakcore Manor, different subject and different story. But I'll never forget just how important it was for Don and his fellow, Easy Company members to tell their story. And Ambrose decided to write that book in between a book called D-Day that he wrote and Citizen Soldier. And he had kind of a year, and he was a professor in Louisiana at the university. And he, as a history professor, decided, I'm going to write this book just instead of doing it, 10,000 foot and what the generals were seeking, thinking and all that strategy. I'm just going to go down into the trenches, into the foxholes. I want to find one specific company to be able to write about. And so he met Dick Winters, he met Buck Compton, he met Don Malarkey. In fact, it was Dick, Don Malarkey, and Carwood Lipton who traveled with Ambrose before he wrote the book, so they could go to the different battle sites and talk about it. And Don had an excellent memory. And so if your listeners are interested in a World War II book from the soldier's perspective, there would be three that I would recommend. And one is Band of Brothers. Read the book, excellent. And then I go to Easy Company Soldier, which was written by Don Malarkey with the help of Bob Welch. And I participated in editing and working on that book and getting that whole project started. That was, came out in 2008. It was a great book. And the other one is Call of Duty. That's by Lieutenant Buck Compton, who is also one of my best friends. And that's a different kind of book, but it goes through Buck's entire life as a athlete and working and playing at UCLA with Jackie Robinson, going into the military, his military career, policeman, prosecutor, convicting Sirhan for the murder of Robert Kennedy, and then going on to be a judge on the Court of Appeals appointed by Reagan. And he describes all of that. And it was Buck who kept on bending my arm behind my back and saying, Vance, just apply to become a judge. And I said, Buck, you've been smoking marijuana. It ain't going to happen.
That guy from California.
I'm a Republican in Oregon. I mean, the 6 other Republicans love me, but the Democrats don't. So why would Kit Sommer ever do that? And I put my application in and I got appointed. And Buck spoke at my investiture when they put the robe on me, and I cried. He was so sweet to be there, and he spoke so eloquently. And then he died 2 months later.
Just 2 months.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the men who went through this understood the importance of leadership beyond just the battlefield. They understood why that needed to be something that you extend into civilian life and to be a participant. And it's so hard. I spent a lot of my time trying to get people, you spent a lot of time trying to get people to understand the importance of leadership and citizenry, civics, engagement, and what's going on, because we remember today people who died so that we could do this stuff. And I think that's probably one of the biggest takeaways I have from Memorial Day is it reminds me that freedom is not free, and you cannot take it for granted, and you cannot take for granted what these guys did. It's almost like I just saw this the other day, we have something incumbent on us every day to be worthy of the sacrifice that they made so that we could be here and do this and be free to do it.
You're right, Kevin. We have a duty to discharge to those who came before us. And that duty, it's not a light duty. It isn't an overwhelming duty, but it's one that I think most Americans have. How do I put this? have forgotten, in the sense that the tyranny of the urgent in a busy communicative lifestyle with, cell phones and social media and television and this microcosm of stuff coming at us, we tend to forget that those who came before us sacrificed so much so that we could live in a constitutional republic. And we keep on calling our constitutional republic a democracy. It is not.
Yeah.
And a constitutional republic requires certain things of its citizens, and public service is one of them in some form or another. And so that duty that I have has to be discharged through using my talents in order to support the republic and remind people and talk about what's happening in the future, so that those who come after us, I've got unborn great great grandchildren that I have a duty to leave a legacy of liberty to. And I can't discharge that duty by just going about my daily life being controlled by the tyranny of the urgent and the media. I have to thoughtfully sit down and think about, what am I going to do as a citizen of this great republic to leave a legacy for those who come after me.
Amen. I mean, that's now it's interesting that when we were talking about Don, he's like this quintessential Oregon story. I think that's also meaningful for people here in Oregon, because I mean, a lot of the time we just dismiss Oregon out of hand as one of these places where you're more likely to see a flag burned than honored in certain parts, like in Portland. But then again, who couldn't connect with Don Malarkey? When I look at he was born in Astoria, Oregon.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
He went to Astoria High School. And I don't know what
basketball. He had older, an older brother and a younger brother, and he lived out an Oregon coast, existence.
Yeah, he fought fires in the Tillamook burn, and
at 12 years old.
Which should have been a sign of what he was made of. But then, he actually, during his first semester at University of Oregon in 1941, that's when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and just everything changed, like it did for so many people in the country at that point. He tried to enlist in the Marines, but got rejected because of dental problems, which is,
and the dental problems weren't, Don, it was funny because I know that story really, really well. But he went up to what's now the Solomon Federal Courthouse, and the Marines were doing, going through the whole process. And the doctor said, well, you're a 100% physical specimen, Mr. Malarkey. You'd be great for the Marines. The problem is there is a regulation that relates back to, like, at the founding of our country, that you have to have these two molars in the back because they connect a certain type of medical device to that. And they don't use it anymore, but it was used. You could, if you attached it back there and you manipulated it in such a way, it actually put the person unconscious.
Really?
Yeah.
So they had ability to put you under.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow. And so if you don't have those two molars, according to the regulation, and you don't, Mr. Malarkey, you can't be a Marine. Now, we're trying to change that stupid regulation because it has nothing to do with modern medicine, but it's still on the books. So I'm sorry, you can't be a Marine.
Oh my gosh.
So, because he was missing those two molars. They'd been pulled out when he was younger. And so funny story, but yeah, Don was one of those people. He had, my wife would call it, a very strong justice part. There was a part of him that when he saw injustice, he became furious. There would be times where I've got dozens of examples where we would be somewhere and he would see something and feel that sense of, I'm going to say something. And I was like, no, please don't say anything. Please don't say anything. Because it would, he'd just stand up and just raw. And he had an angry justice part, and it displayed itself. But, that carried him through a lot. He had such a tender heart. But that guy was a lion. And these all, it took, I think the statistics are, you had to get 5 volunteers to get one person to graduate from basic training at Toccoa.
Wow. Yeah, because
So
it was a kind of a washout rate, right? I mean,
high washout rate.
yeah,
And
just like special forces today,
yeah,
it's really difficult. You have to have a bunch of people go in and only select few come out, right?
yeah, well, and you went through a great deal of physical training and then strategic training and combat training. And then you had to have 5 successful jumps out of a C-47. And they just, guys just couldn't do it. And Don had that push through part. He would just push through no matter what. And when I would really encourage your listeners, if they want to read again a great book, Easy Company Soldier, you'll get a sense of what Don went through. And it it he's very, in fact, after he wrote the book, and the book was very successful, as you and I've talked about before. You don't make money doing, autobiographies yourself. Now, this was printed by Penguin Random House, and so they marketed it very well. Don did very well with that book. A lot of people don't. And he would get letters, hundreds and hundreds of letters. And many of them would be from the daughters of combat veterans at different wars, particularly World War II or Korea. And they would say to Don, thank you. Thank you for sharing what happened to you, because my father, I never understood. He was like this silent, distant person who never talked about it, or he drank, and that's the only time he talked about it. And he was angry, and he'd have nightmares or whatever it was. And they would say at the end of their letters, and Don would cry when he read them, I now understand what my father went through, and he's long dead. But I just want to say thank you for sharing your story, because now I understand my dad's story.
Yeah.
And we need to do that as a nation. There are still, my good friend Paul de Muniz served in Vietnam, and when he came home on the plane, he was instructed, take off your uniform, put on your civilian clothes, and when you walk out of this plane, get ready to be spit on. And he was, and he never looked back. And until 2014, when we did our first graduation from the Marion County Veterans Court, and he was our speaker, he said to those who were graduating, this is my homecoming. I never had one.
Didn't have one. Yeah.
No. And we hung his picture, from Vietnam. We had a great museum on the 4th floor, which tended to make my progressive, colleagues lose their marbles, because, oh, you're putting up war art. No, we're actually honoring those in Marion County who served. It was ridiculous. But Paul, it was a good reminder to me that we, when we meet veterans, just need to thank them. Welcome home. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that people had to live with the consequences of what happened both during their time in service, but also sometimes, like with Vietnam, what happened afterwards. I remember pretty vividly when the Vietnam War Memorial was put together, and the first time, it was sometime in the 80s, that they actually had something amounting to a not a ticker tape parade, but a welcome home for Vietnam veterans who just 10 years earlier were being treated as baby killers and all that garbage. That there's a healing, and I think that's maybe what we're reminded of on Memorial Day, on Veterans Day, Armed Forces Day, is that there's a healing that goes on that is important, not just for those who served, but for the families of those who didn't make it home, and for all of us, because it's not memory hole day, it's Memorial Day, right? We're not sticking these things down a hole and forgetting
That's
about
right.
them. It's as you said, remembrance. It's bringing back and reliving it, which it seems to be essential to, in particular, to the United States, because I know this
Absolutely.
exists for other countries, but it reminds us, I think, of the seriousness and difficulty of war, but also the fact that um, it was a necessity that is easily forgotten in a time when, I mean, the prosperity and the safety and all that we enjoy now, the security, that is not the norm, is it? In
No,
history.
no, it's not. I would encourage, your listeners, you don't have to do it on Memorial Day. But to think about those that that served. I've got a good friend who was a paratrooper, airborne soldier in Vietnam, and I'm going to call him later on today because he lost friends, and just tell him, "Hey, Barney, just want to thank you. Just I care for you. I love you. I appreciate your friendship with me, and I appreciate what you've done for this nation." And just make it simple. We don't understand sometimes the consequence of an individual contact like that. Just saying something can change the course of a person's history. I mean, I'm thinking right now about, people look at the movie Saving Private Ryan as a watershed for our nation, and it was. There are studies that have been done to show that the movie Saving Private Ryan, which was, came out in 1998, approximately, maybe it was 97, 8, 9, sometime in there. It changed the current generation, the younger generation's view of World War II and those that they knew that had served. I
Yeah.
mean, they went, "Oh my gosh, you went through that?"
Yeah.
They began to appreciate. But the story behind the story with Saving Private Ryan was that theme about four brothers going to war, three of them being killed, and then one surviving after D-Day. He was a paratrooper, and he was with the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. That's the story that Saving Private Ryan is about, and that's a true story to a certain extent. It's about the Nyland brothers. Well, Fritz Nyland was one of Don's friends. In fact, Skip Buck, who was killed on January 9th, 1945 in Foy, Belgium, was Fritz's best friend. And it was Fritz and Don and Skip and then brother Bob Nyland who palled around in London. Here's the point. Don Malarkey, in an off interview with Stephen Ambrose in his basement, I have the transcript because Ambrose gave it to me. It was transcribed, it was taped. Don was telling him stories that he was going to use. This is in 1990 in the book Band of Brothers. And Don told him the story about four brothers who went to war and how Fritz was pulled out of the battle in Carentan. And it's in Band of Brothers, as in the movie. You see a little bit of it. But here's the point. Don had no idea at the time in 1990, as he was telling that story to Stephen Ambrose, that Stephen Ambrose would put it into the book Band of Brothers. And Ambrose was a great self-promoter.
Yeah.
And he got together with Steven Spielberg, and he said, "Look at this book. Here's a story of four brothers. Do you think you could do a movie about that?" And
jeez, wow.
Saving Private Ryan came about because of the story that Don Malarkey told in Salem, Oregon. Wow. And it was that movie which brought about that Hanks and Spielberg and Ambrose and all those people got together, and the World War II Memorial was created. Band of Brothers as a 10-part miniseries was created, and there was a whole flood of new information and a respect for these World War II soldiers. So we never know what a simple word, a simple encouragement, a simple story told to somebody, it may change the world.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes it's easy to think of history as something that either destiny, or that history was sort of this static thing that you could just look back on and as facts, figures, etc. But then you get to talk to or hear from these stories, these individuals who lived it, and connect with what it must have been like to be. How old was he when he? Because
when he went in,
yeah,
Don was 22.
Yeah, so 18 to 22-year-olds.
He was an old man, he said.
Well, and yeah, but he also had to leave college. That's my grandfather, my dad's father, is more of a World War One story because he was at Notre Dame, and then over there we joined the war, and uh, all these guys are suddenly commissioned as second lieutenants and sent off to training, and boom, everybody's lives changed. He got injured in training, actually, damaged his sight, lost depth perception, and so he didn't end up getting shipped over there because of, well, when that happens, but I was thinking of that when you were talking about training and how tough that could be, how they would lose guys jumping out of planes just to train.
Just in training. Yeah.
And then to go over there and to be, I think you said it's a 96% casualty rate for that unit. And yet these stories help people connect with the real human beings that did all this.
And those stories tend to encourage us to make the right decisions at the right time. I mean, I don't, from a faith perspective, I view, I guess I could say I was raised Calvinist in the sense that, God's will, he's sovereign. It's going to happen no matter what. You don't have much of a choice. It's predestined. Well, I've really shifted away from that because I believe that we have individual self-government that's given to us as a gift. That's the liberty of autonomy. And when we accept the invitation to take an adventure, whatever that may be, we create destiny, many times in partnership with our creator who's making that invitation to us. And so I look at Don Malarkey or Buck Compton or my friend Dick Winters, Carwood Lipton, all these soldiers who, made significant life-altering decisions, decision by decision. It wasn't just, I'm going to run for president of the United States. And there was a series of decisions that you look at their lives that they made, some of them bad decisions, but most of them good in the sense of, I will be courageous. I will have honor. I will do what's right. I mean, that's why character is so important. You cannot have a functioning constitutional republic without seeing the big picture and making choices that are character oriented to support that republic.
Yeah.
And I fear that this generation, any generation, as Reagan said, it only takes one generation to lose liberty.
Yeah, to extinction. Yeah.
And we are looking at a culture right now where people are making, decisions for their own benefit. They're majoring in the minors. And there's a philosophical shift where there's a real dividing line. Either you're a white supremacist and a racist and it's terrible and you're part of the patriarchy and all this whole narrative, which is not correct history.
Yeah.
Or you have a view that no, we are an exceptional people. We come from an exceptional group of people that inculcated us with the sense of liberty and self-government, unlike any other nation in the world. That's where I stand.
Yeah,
and I will fight
and not perfect people, and not perfect people.
Absolutely.
Which is why what you said about making decisions is really the key. Somebody asked me the other day, like, when you pray, do you ever get an answer? And I said, yeah. And I think that what's interesting about it is, but you have to be looking for the answer. Sometimes you have to be open to it. It may not come in package the way you're expecting. It's not
exactly
going to be a voice. It's going to be a series of choices presented to you. And you have this opportunity to look at history, at the wisdom that existed before us, at the divine inspiration. And certainly we've got a country that wouldn't even be here, as was acknowledged in the Declaration of Independence, without divine providence. So it's just, there's so many things that are this day today brings. It's a day about history, but then it's also a day about the future and whether we're going to take to heart the lessons that are learned. And by the way, with Don Malarkey, it's interesting. So he came back to Oregon. He completed his degree, And then he served as a county commissioner in Clatsop County for
Yeah, a
a year.
Republican.
Yeah, that's right. And in
In
fact, Stephen
Clatsop
Ambrose
County,
in Clatsop County, right, which is
which at the time was, he called it run by the Democrat mob. Um, and
he called it like he saw it.
yeah, well, Don always did that, and he was Don stepped into the battle many times of his life, and he fought for what was right, and he felt that the way that government was wasting money and the Tillamook burn money that was coming in to help regenerate. I mean, this is 15, 20 years after the Tillamook burn. He just said, some of these people are corrupt, and I'm just going to run against them. And he did, and he won. And he lost, I think, by just a couple votes when he was trying to get his second term. And I think that kind of was a watershed for him as well. He felt kind of ostracized by the community by that, and he picked up and moved to Portland. He started a real estate business, and he did fine in his real estate business. But I think over the 60s and watching in the 70s, our culture kind of drift from its moorings and all the stuff that was going on in Watergate. Don became very good friends with a fellow named Johnny Walker Black, and that whiskey, it took him down some paths that were really difficult for him. And his family stuck by him, and he just suffered a lot. But he ended up working for the state. They moved to Salem. He did that, and then retired in 84, I think it was. May have been a little bit before that. And then he loved to pick blackberries and make blackberry jam. It was really good blackberry jam. I wish I had some more. And he would, he engaged life. And when I got to know him before, and he became a good friend, it was a result of another veteran buddy of mine who had died, and I had handled his estate, and his family gave me his uniform and all his World War II pictures as just a kind of an homage to him. And my hobby at the time was historical framing. So I made a historical framing piece featuring those. And I wanted to know where some of those pictures were. And I won't give you the background to how I happened to find out that Don Malarkey lived like 6 blocks from my law office. But I called him up. We got together and we became very good friends. And I used to go to his home in the evening at times after work and just sitting, and he would tell me stories. And he had memorized the entire poem, Kittredge poem, Gunga Din, in college, and he could still recite it word for word. And if you add a little bit of whiskey to that, oh yeah, he'd forget that he just recited the whole thing to you, and he'd recite it again. And he could sing Johnny Boy. Or excuse me, not Johnny, Daniel Boy.
Danny Boy,
yeah. Danny Boy, and anyway, he was just a fun person to be with. He had a big heart, and he was a good example of a generation that spent themselves and endured a lifetime of difficulty after they're giving so much for our nation. And we forget that many of these combat veterans, I was just in church a few weeks ago and was chatting with a young man who had just come to faith, and he was explaining to me, his Marine unit and what happened. And he said, I kind of buried that stuff, but it's coming up now, and I don't know what to do with it. And so we were able to pray with him and chat with him and work through some issues with him. And now he's part of our men's group. And there's, just because he brought that up. And many times we meet veterans who, have seen their buddies, perish in really difficult circumstances, or get extremely, wounded and have to live with those loss of limbs and everything. And we need to saddle up next to them and do life with them and honor them and just be present.
And so Don was the oldest surviving member of Easy Company. He passed in September of 2017. The one thing that really, besides going through the very details of the Bray Court Manor um, assault, which is still being studied
At West Point, yeah.
at West Point because of how skillful it was and how the odds were obviously against them, but they were a small unit.
13 Americans against, it was about 30 German paratroopers who were extremely, I mean, they were combat veterans, and these young Americans had never been in combat.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, because I had the opportunity with Don to lecture at West Point, and by the way, I have no business lecturing on leadership at the White House or before Congress or at West Point, except for Don Malarkey and Buck Compton.
Yeah.
And so it is who you know, not what you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But what they told us at West Point is it's not so much, yes, the tactical Dick Winter's ability to see tactical advantages and deploy his troops along with Buck Compton, that was important. But the real reason that they teach it still at West Point was to show that the ingenuity of a self-governing unit is very different than the German, you obey the officer. But if the officer got killed, what the hell do we do now?
Yeah.
Nobody, that the liberty oriented of that generation of pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps, you make your decision. So you killed a lieutenant or the master sergeant or the first sergeant, somebody in that American unit would step up and take leadership. That's that ingenuity and ability to be adroit and move quickly and make individual decisions in order to benefit the whole is why West Point still teaches the battle at Break or Manor. Dick Winters was put up for the Medal of Honor. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, and his medals and photographs hung in my courtroom for years. Buck Compton in that battle received a Silver Star, Don Malarkey the Bronze Star with oak leaf clusters. Yeah. And people don't understand that they fought valiantly in D-Day, on D-Day, and then for the 4 weeks after. They later jumped into Holland and were in World War I type conditions for 90 days. And then they were in the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne, where they were surrounded 25-1. Fought through Germany and eventually ended up at Hitler's Eagle's Nest. They were the unit that captured Hitler's Eagle's Nest and then went into occupation duty. I mean, so they went through the entire war and they fought in the most significant battles.
And, it's fascinating to look at. Well, I remember hearing you and Don talking about this, because if you go on like Wikipedia and it shows medals and decorations, there's like 15 of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bronze Star with oak leaf clusters is the first one. And when you would ask him, you say, because we obviously use the word hero pretty loosely nowadays. And exemplar, I think, is a great word. But you ask him who the heroes were. I remember his answer. It's not him.
No. He said something along the lines of, I'm not a hero, but I served in a company of heroes.
Yeah.
They were, I can see the invitation that was sent to my family to go to the HBO premiere in Europe. And we've got it framed downstairs, but it says something like ordinary men who did extraordinary things. And that's what we all are as Americans. We're ordinary people, but we have a character. We should have an inculcated character of honor and duty and self-sacrifice, and that we govern ourselves in a way which produces liberty as the result, not tyranny. And that's why it's so important that we fight against this internal rot that says that the rule of law is going to be heteronymous. And what I mean by that is that heter to anonymous, not anonymous, law, two forms of law, and we're cascading toward that cliff very quickly, where the elites get a special pass when it comes to the rule of law, but the rest of us, no, it applies to us. And so there's a duality in the legal system at the present, and that will destroy our republic if we don't stand. Don and Buck, I mean, I remember Buck as a judge. He and I would sit out on our deck deep into the night discussing legal theory. And if anything caused Buck to be unnerved, it was this trending toward lawlessness.
Yeah.
And this was 15 years ago. And he used to say things like, where the rule of law ends, tyranny begins. And what we're seeing in our nation right now is tyranny in so many forms.
Yeah.
And where you can have hundreds of nights of riots in Portland and very few people arrested and very few prosecutions even resulting from the millions of dollars of damage that was done.
Yeah.
So I would call upon your listeners to really be thinking about looking at what you as a people, and we as Oregonians can do to stand up against this pernicious evil, which says, no, it's all relevant. Your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. There is no objective standard. Well, hell yes, there is an objective standard. It's written into the law of nature by our Creator. And there is a right and a wrong. And law applies to all people at all times, in all places, in the same manner. And when we shift off that foundation stone, we can't have a republic.
I remember something that I got to ask Don. Because I think you see, you hear all these stories, you see all these things that they experienced, and we just established that humility is something that you get from these guys. I think one of the most important character features. But at the same time, I remember asking him, so how did you know you were, with all this stuff that was happening? Were you confident? Or did you at some time lose heart that you could be victorious? And he just answered. I never forget the answer. We knew we were going to win.
Mm-hmm.
We knew that we were going to prevail. We all felt it. A unit that gets 96% casualties.
Yeah.
That belief, that optimism, that's part of the American character too, that we get to be reminded of today, of how we can overcome all these things as long as we apply ourselves and persevere. What better example could there be of that than talking about Don and Easy Company and Buck and Dick today?
You're right, Kevin. May I close with one short story?
Absolutely.
Don and Buck, we were, sitting out talking about the battle at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne being sent there by Eisenhower. And what Eisenhower said in Versailles, where the SHAEF headquarters, the Supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, when Hitler launched the surprise attack on December 16th, 1944, it totally took the United States Army by surprise. And the 26th Infantry Division 29th, just overrun. I think on the 20th, maybe it was the 17th, 18th of December, 20,000 men surrendered or were killed, wounded on that one day. That's a lot of guys.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower said when he walked into that, historians have shown us, he walked into the headquarters and said, there will be no glum faces. This is an opportunity. This is my paraphrasing, but Hitler's put his head in a noose. He's gone deep into our territory and we're going to cut him off. And he pointed at Bastogne and he said, that city I'm sending the 101st Airborne to, and they must hold it because it is the hub of a road network. And the Germans have to have Bastogne because they can't get their armor across those muddy fields in the winter without having those roads. And so Don and Buck and his whole unit were sent. Boom, in the middle of the night, they were on trucks. And they hadn't even had winter clothing issued to them yet. They didn't have their weapons, half of them. They had to scramble and ammunition. When Don went into combat, I think it was on the 18th of December, 1944, as the 29th and 16th Infantry were just 116th Division were pouring back through Bastogne, running. Buck and Don were moving forward toward the front lines, and Buck had a carbine. Don had a carbine rifle, and he turned to Buck, who was his lieutenant, and he said, "Hey, you got any ammunition?" Because Don had none. He had a grenade, and he had an empty rifle, and he was wearing, summer uniform in the dead of winter. Within the week, it would be 10 degrees at night. And Buck had 2 clips of 8 bullets each, and he tossed one to Don, and Buck had 8 bullets, and Don had 8 bullets, and into combat they went.
Wow.
That amazes me. And I've stood in those foxholes. They're still there today. They're not 4 feet deep or 5 feet deep like they used to be, but they're still there. And we had metal detectors. I have in framing pieces, bullets from the 506 rusted, shrapnel, buttons. I mean, when you stand in the presence of the past like that, it changes you. And every American needs to educate themselves on what we've gone through in order to protect our liberty and understand it, be fluid in it, be able to discuss each of the conflicts. I have pictures, framing pieces of my ancestors going back, having served in the Revolutionary War. They didn't have pictures back then, but I have a bayonet from the Revolutionary War. And when pictures began, I got memorabilia from each of my family members who served. Some of them died. And my grandchildren, when they walk downstairs into our basement, they go down the stairs, and their relatives from every part of their family, dozens and dozens of framing pieces, are there to remind them of from whence they come. And they are learning. And we'll go to the cemetery just right at the edge of our property, Little Pioneer Cemetery here in Powell Butte this morning or later today. And we will honor those dead, even though we don't know them, because they have to understand that they stand in a unique place in history, and it will be part of their legacy to maintain this republic. And they will do so because they honored the past and were inspired by those who gave their lives so that we could have this liberty.
Well, that is a great way to wrap up, Vance. Thank you so much for being here with us on this special episode of the Captive Audience today. And God bless you. And God bless everybody who sacrificed so much so that we could just be here and talk about this today and share with future generations. Everybody, please take the time to do more than barbecue today. At least take a moment to remember all of these folks and remind the younger people just how important it is. Again, thank you, Vance, and really appreciate you taking the time. I know we both got to get on to some things here today, and I look forward to seeing you in person again here sometime soon, because it's been a little while, but this will be airing tonight at 6:00 live streaming, so folks will get a chance to take it in, and if they want to, I'm going to post some of the links that you gave me, so if they want more information about Don and his book and the things that he's done, I'll make sure that they all get an opportunity to see that, as well as the exemplar, because he is exemplar.
Yeah, he is. Well, thank you, Kevin. It was great to be with you and your audience. I'll love to do it again sometime.
You got it. Everyone, will be back tomorrow night with another episode of the Captive Audience. It probably should be David and I just talking about the news and the headlines, of which there will be plenty, no matter what. And again, remember the price of freedom and the importance of passing on liberty to future generations. We'll keep doing that every day. Thanks, and have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.